Okay, welcome everybody. It's a couple minutes after 6, so I think we're going to go ahead and start. And I'm so glad to have you back here, and that you survived last week and agreed to come back is just a thrill for me. So thank you for doing this. Thank you in advance for those of you that agreed to do some readings. No pressure. You can read, you can comment, you can do whatever you like, but this will save the group from hearing only me, which would be welcome. There were a couple of suggestions made last week which I thought were helpful. First, a thanks to John Atkins, who suggested I put some maps in. So John, I got some maps for you. And Jerry, you had suggested having a biography of some of the people that we were talking about, and you referenced Telemachus, so I've got that in here. This is the second of 6 talks, and I've tried to make each one of them different so that we'll have a different approach to this, but today we begin the Iliad. The Iliad is the oldest of the 2 epics, and it's the longer of the 2 epics, 16,000 lines. Probably 30 years older. To me, that's really important, because if we believe that Homer wrote these, and I do, or at least that he assembled the Iliad and wrote the Odyssey, however you want to argue it, the Iliad he's writing from the point of view of a younger person, perhaps a young man. And we're looking at, in this story, we're looking at the development of a young man. In the Odyssey is much different, and the story will go much differently, and we'll emphasize that. But I wanted to bring this to your attention before we started. This is a picture that I took 2 weeks ago of the sunset at Delphi, which I thought you would enjoy again. So beautiful. I was walking down there, turned around, and just watched the sun go down over the ruins. It was magnificent. Oops. This is a review of what we did last week, just so we can catch us up where we left off, and why we thought Homer was important. He's the foundation of Western history and culture. Herodotus and Thucydides believed what he was saying was true. That was the foundation for the Greek idea of their own history. And as we've said, the history of Greece becomes the history of Western Europe, which becomes the history of us. The invention of the alphabet, which was concurrent with Homer, is so extraordinary, I don't think it was chance. I think the 2 were related. Nobody can prove me wrong, so I can enjoy my fantasy. But I think Homer was so great that somebody sitting on the island of Euboea said, gotta write that down. Oops, we don't have any letters to write with. We gotta find an alphabet. And so that's what happened. So the alphabet and Homer come together at the same time. With that, we have the first clearly articulated artistic image of the human soul, because we know exactly what Homer was saying. We don't have to look at a cave wall. We don't have to look at a building and guess. We know what he said. It's an unsurpassed artistic accomplishment to be able to do this. Remember, we said he didn't memorize this. He synthesized it every time. And he did this with some wonderful techniques that maybe we'll talk about. And it's still relevant to us today because we have a new translation. Many of us met Emily Wilson. And the archaeology and psychology that are relevant to this topic are still current in our conversation. Here's the first map that I thought would be helpful. And it goes all the way from Western Greece, and there is Kephallonia and the island of Ithaca. We'll go into this in more detail, all the way over to Mesopotamia. And remember, we mentioned that cuneiform was invented in Ur in the 3rd and 4th millennium BCE, and that hieroglyphics here, both of these preceded Greek alphabet by over 1,000 years, and yet they did not become the foundation of Western culture because they were not easily reproduced and they were not available for an artistic manifestation. I think that they're largely a political and an economic language. Here's Greece. And there's Troy. And remember, we mentioned that there was another name for Troy. It happens to be Ilium. That's why we call it the Iliad. And in the Hittite texts, from Hattusas in cuneiform is the name Wilusa. So we believe we have a confirmation of the Trojan War, not just from the Greeks, but also from the Hittites. So here's the map of what we're talking about. These are the Greeks in the Trojan War. Menelaus is the king of Sparta, and it was his wife Helen that was whisked back to Troy by Paris. Agamemnon, his brother, is the king of Mycenae. Achilles, who's the greatest warrior on either side, came from central Greece. and Patroclus, who was his dear friend, and with whom he lived in a tent for a long time during the war, came from the same area. Nestor was the king of Pylos, a generation older perhaps. He was the senior guy in the Greek troops. And of course, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, Diomedes, the king of Argos, 2 Ajaxes, and Idomeneus from Crete. I'll show you another map with these people on it, but this will help to let you know those are the principles that we'll talk about for the Greeks. And the Trojans all came from one family except for Helen. Priam is the king, Hecuba is his queen, Paris is his son, Helen is the woman that Paris absconded with, Hector is the other son, the prince of Troy, and Andromache is Hector's wife. So those are the people that we'll be meeting as we go through the Iliad, and I hope this introduction to them will be helpful to you. And as we come across them again, I'll try to be a little bit more clear on what their roles are. So let's just go around. This is a little bit better map. Here is the Paliki Peninsula of Kephallonia, which I think was the original Ithaca, where Odysseus came from. Nestor, the senior member, came from Pylos. Agamemnon came from Mycenae. Interesting to note that Mycenae is not right on the sea, and I'll show you a neat picture about how he got his troops going in their boats. Menelaos from Sparta with his queen, Helen, who was stolen. Diomedes from Tiryns, the 2 Ajaxes, and Achilles from the central part of Greece, and then up there Priam and his whole family at Troy, just below the Dardanelles. So this is part 2. The themes I would like us to be thinking about as we go through here, Homer's skill. And I hope that by reading some of the words, we're going to read less than 400 lines of the 16,000 line poem. But I hope that the ones that I've selected will be helpful in giving a sense of what a genius he was. So we'll talk about Homer's skill. We'll get an insight into Mycenaean life. What was it like for these people to live? And Homer describes that nicely. And always in the back of our mind should be the relationship between masculine and feminine. We're going to see a profound transformation between this story and the Odyssey. And it will be one of my major hypotheses about the importance of Homer from a psychological standpoint, looking at the relationship between men and women, masculine and feminine, and how that may change. Sorry. The Judgment of Paris. Are you familiar with the Judgment of Paris? It's how the Trojan War began. There's a party on Olympus. Somebody's going to get married. And Eris, the goddess, mind you, the woman, she's a goddess, of discord is not invited. You don't want to have the goddess of discord invited to your wedding party. And so she decides to come anyway. And she takes an apple and she rolls it into the party and said, "This is for the most important goddess in the room." Well, of course, there's Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all at the party. Zeus takes one look at this and says, "I'm not touching that." He said, "No way." So he says, "Oh, Paris, your call." Well, Paris looks at this opportunity and he's offered fame and money. But then Aphrodite comes along and says, "I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world." Well, foolish Paris, he made that choice not realizing, perhaps, that she was already married to Menelaus. But he said, "I'll take her." And that was the source. The Judgment of Paris was the problem that underlay this whole story. Because Paris ran away with Helen. Paris was visiting Sparta. Menelaus made the mistake of taking a little side trip to Crete. And while he was away, big mistake, while he was away, Helen and Paris fled back to Troy, hiding behind the walls of this magnificent fortress. Well, Menelaus is very upset and very angry, and he wants to get her back. And before he'd married her, there had been an oath of Tyndareus that anybody that messes with Helen, the whole community is going to go defend Menelaus. So he has to go get her back, and all the soldiers, all the kings around Greece had promised that they would help should anything happen to Helen, and that's how the troops were gathered together. So the Judgment of Paris, which was fundamental to this conflict, brought about the Paris stealing Helen, taking her back to Troy, and then the ensuing war. A comment about some of the gods with a special comment about Athena. Zeus is the king, head of Olympus. His wife's sister is Hera. Poseidon is brother, second, and Hades is third. God of the earthquake, god of the sea, god of the underworld. Hermes is a very interesting god. We won't see him too much until the very end, but he's the god of transitions. When Zeus wants to have something change, he says, Hermes, go make it change. Hermes will become for us a very important construct for the psychological concept of change. But he's important in these stories too. Apollo, we all know, is the god of the sun, and Athena. Athena is very interesting. She is Zeus's daughter. But Zeus thought when his wife Metis was pregnant that he would be replaced, Zeus would be replaced by a child of Metis, that what he would do was to solve the problem, and he swallowed Metis, not realizing that Metis was pregnant. So that the pregnant Metis swallowed by Zeus, ultimately Athena is born. But she's born from a rift in Zeus's head. And she comes out of his head fully armed, with a spear and a shield and a sword and a helmet. She's a virgin goddess, and so because of this, she's a perfect psychological projection for the feminine in support of the masculine, and she plays a key role here because she loves Odysseus and his whole family, and she hates the Trojans, and she wants this war to happen. So let's take a look at some of these characters here. This is a painting of the birth of Athena. Can you see her up there? She's coming right out of Zeus's head. This is on a crater. And the reason for showing this is to let you know that these kinds of images are everywhere all over, so that the Greeks, as they are living this, living in their lives, are continually confronted by these stories. This is the citadel at Mycenae, a picture that I took about 2 weeks ago, and this is where Agamemnon came from. I have to tell you what a thrill it was for me to get there. It's a long hike up there, but to stand at the top of this where Agamemnon and his wife Clytemnestra, and those of you may know that they had a problem when he came back, lived right up there on Arastia. That was his home. So this is the citadel at Mycenae. It's being excavated now. And this is the magnificent lion gate under which you have to walk when you're getting up to the citadel. Very impressive place. And this is where Agamemnon lived. That's his mask. The excavation done at Mycenae by Schliemann in about 1870, or a little later, unearthed that. Can you imagine his surprise? Now, we don't know if that truly is the mask of Agamemnon. Many archaeologists think it's a little bit older than Agamemnon would have been there. But that's the iconic image of what Agamemnon looks like. This is in the Greek Museum. It's a picture I took. You can see the reflection of the glass there, but maybe many of you have seen this before, and that's Agamemnon. So I had to figure out, Agamemnon's about to get his troops together and head off for Troy. We're not quite into the Iliad yet. And so he has to get all his troops together, and as I pointed out, Mycenae is not on the water. But there's a little citadel called Asini. And I wanted to see where he had all of his ships, 1,000 ships that he gathered to make his trip to start the war. I got to Asini late at night, and so I couldn't climb up there. It was too dangerous to climb up there. But I decided what I would do is walk down to the beach. And as I got down to the beach and looking out at the water where Agamemnon would have been with all of his troops, I turned around and the moon had just risen over Asini. Isn't that amazing? And you can see the outline of the citadel here. And that's where Agamemnon left, disembarked on his way to Troy. Well, he had to make a stop at Aulis on the way, and that's another place I really wanted to see. There's a famous play, Iphigenia at Aulis. But that was the last step, stopping in Aulis before he went to Troy. And he had a problem. Here's Alice. We found it. It's down a little dirt road, and it's very obscure. But as you can see, it's surrounded by hills. The problem that Agamemnon had was there was no wind, and his ships were becalmed there. And the story is the only way he could get a wind was to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, which he did. And the wind blew at that point. And so off they went to Troy, and the battle starts. So let's get into the war. This is the beginning of the Iliad. You would think that Homer would say, well, let's start the war, but he doesn't. The rage of Achilles. That's how he begins this story. And the way we'll do this is that I'll go through the important parts of each chapter, but some of you are going to do some of the readings with us, and we'll try to keep the story clear as we enjoy some of the language. Homer begins in medias res, right in the middle of things. He doesn't begin with a war on the plains of Troy. He starts out with the rage. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles. Well, why was he angry? Why would we begin the story that way? Well, the war had been going on for 10 years. And the Greeks had to supply themselves, so they made a raid on a little town called Chrysae, which is not too far from Troy. And when they got there, they found a temple to Apollo, and they stole 2 people. They stole the daughter of the priest of the temple of Apollo, and her name was Chryseis, and her friend Briseis. And they took them back. Well, that was a problem, because the priest at the temple of Apollo said, the Greeks have stolen my daughter, and he was praying to Apollo. He said, you got to do something about this. So Apollo puts a plague on the Greeks, and they're sitting there in the plains of Troy, suffering a plague and going nowhere in the war. Well, Chalcus is a soothsayer, and he explains to the Greeks, this is what happened. You've got to do something about this. And so, here's our introduction to Odysseus. Odysseus is selected by the Greeks to be the most circumspect, careful, thoughtful person to return Chryseis to her father and to make a sacrifice and to make amends and to stop this plague. And so that's exactly what happens. The problem is, now that Chryseis is back with her father, Agamemnon no longer has Chryseis. So Agamemnon says, I really deserve somebody, so Achilles, you had Briseis, no, I'll take her. That's a bad, bad decision. Because as soon as he did that, Achilles almost killed him. But Athena stopped him, and there's Achilles with no option except to get angry. And he's in a rage. And that's a problem, because everybody knows that until Achilles fights, the Greeks can't win. So that's why we begin the story with the rage of Achilles. And we'll do a little bit of reading about Odysseus, sacrifice, and then the relationship between Zeus and Hera, which I find so fascinating. Do we have whoever is here reading book 1? Wonderful. Okay, here's the way we're going to do this, Janice. I'll have the words up here so that everybody else can be reading them as you're reading them, and then we can talk about them.
You want me to start?
Please.
Those gentlemen over there, there's seats over there.
Yeah, would you guys like to come in and sit? Oh, come on.
Sorry, excuse us.
You're excused. We're glad to have you. Great. So we'll read 3 short passages from book 1 to get a sense of where we're going.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Meanwhile, Odysseus drew in close to Chrysae Island, bearing the splendid sacrifice in the vessel's hold. And once they had entered the harbor, deep in bays, they furled and stowed the sail in the black ship. They lowered the mast by the forestays, smoothly, quickly let it down on the forked mast crutch, and rowed her into a mooring under oars. Out went the bowstones, cables fast astern, and the crew themselves swung out in the breaking surf, leading out the sacrifice for the archer god Apollo. And out of the deep-sea ship Chryseis stepped too. Then tactful Odysseus led her up to the altar, placing her in her loving father's arms, and said, Chryseis, the lord of men Agamemnon sent me here to bring your daughter back and perform a sacrifice, a grand sacrifice to Apollo, for all Achaea's sake, so we can appease the god who's loosed such grief and torment on the Argives.
That's terrific. Thank you. Janice, did you want to comment on this?
It's just so nice.
You're not obliged.
I like the boat part.
Yeah, I'd like the boat part too. Let me just toss out a couple things that caught my attention. Homer loves expertise. If you're a good sailor, he wants to know it. If you can make something, he wants to know that. If you know how to do something or sing something, he loves expertise. This is our introduction to Homer's love of expertise. Look at how well they sail. Furled and stowed the sail in the black ship, they lowered the mast by the forestays smoothly. Quickly let it down to the forked mast crutch, exactly what you would do. So the sail doesn't billow out, tip the boat over. So he knows exactly what he's doing. And then row them and cast out the bowstones and cables. He knows how to sail, and he appreciates it being done well. So that's one of the things that caught my attention. And then here's an important word here. See if I can find it. Tactful. Yeah. Tactful. We have lots of ways to talk about Odysseus, but he is tactful. We're getting an introduction to Odysseus that'll be very important for us when we get to the Odyssey. But here the Greeks know that he's tactful. He's a good sailor, he can get the job done, and he's tactful. And his language is just perfect, just appropriate to crises. Here's your daughter back. We're going to make a grand sacrifice to Apollo, so we'll stop this terrible grief. So I think that those are the things that I wanted to emphasize there, and here's the next. Yep.
His prayer went up, and Phoebus Apollo heard him. And soon as the men had prayed and flung the barley, first they lifted back the heads of the victims, slit their throats, skinned them, and carved away the meat from the thigh bones, and wrapped them in fat, a double fold sliced clean and topped with strips of flesh. And the old man burned these over dried split wood, and over the quarters poured out glistening wine, while young men at his side held 5-pronged forks. Once they had burned the bones and tasted the organs, they cut the rest into pieces, pierced them with spits, roasted them to a turn, and pulled them off the fire. The work done, the feast laid out, they ate well, and no man's hunger lacked a share of the banquet. When they had put aside desire for food and drink, the young men brimmed the mixing bowls with wine, and tipping first drops for the god in every cup, they poured full rounds for all. And all day long they appeased the god with song, raising a ringing hymn to the distant archer god who drives away the plague. Those young Achaean warriors singing out his power, and Apollo listened, his great heart warm with joy.
Don't you have a feeling of what actually happened in that sacrifice and exactly how they did it? Homer clearly explains how they sacrificed the animals, what's going on, and brings you into the story. You have a very clear idea of exactly what this ritual was to be. And the other thing, when they had put aside desire for food and drink, that line comes up almost every time when there's a sacrifice. So remember we mentioned that about a third of these stories are repeated, but they're not boring. It just happens that this happens to work perfectly right there. And we have one more. This is Zeus and Hera. This is important.
Oh, I see where you started. Okay. Obey my orders, for fear the gods, however many Olympus holds, are powerless to protect you when I come to throttle you with my irresistible hands. He subsided, but Hera the queen, her eyes wider, was terrified. She sat in silence. She wrenched her will to his. Oops, that's the next one.
Let me just stop right here.
Okay.
She wrenched her will to his. That's pretty telling about how the masculine and the feminine are working on Olympus right now. Worth a conversation. It's part of our dialogue even today. And then these last two lines.
There he climbed, and there he slept, and by his side lay Hera the queen, the goddess of the golden throne.
And I would add scared to death. Okay? So, book 2. In book 2, we're going to get the story of the war started. Agamemnon's dream is so remarkable, we're going to read that, but he has a dream. He has a dream, it's a false dream, that he can win the war. So, they get the troops out there. Nestor, one of his allies, gets the troops out there. But Agamemnon says to the troops, he's going to try to see if they're really loyal to him. He says, why don't we all go home? Been a long time. Let's go back to Greece. He's assuming that everybody will say, no, we came to fight. In about a minute, everybody had left the plane and were headed back for the ships on their way back to Greece. They said, no way are we going to stay here and do this when our chief says time to go. So it completely backfired. This is a clue about what kind of person Agamemnon is. So they have to change things. And Odysseus goes out there and he changes things. And it's fascinating how he changes this. You'll get an idea of how wise he is because the words he uses are remarkable. We then see all the Trojan forces that are fighting, and at the last, we'll read a snake omen about the results of how this whole war is going to transpire. But let's take a look at Agamemnon's dream. Who has book 2? Oh, great, Mary.
He would send a murderous dream to Agamemnon. Calling out to the vision, Zeus winged it on. Go, murderous dream, to the fast Achaean ships, and once you reach Agamemnon's shelter, rouse him. Order him, word for word, exactly as I command. Tell Atreus to arm his long-haired Achaeans, to attack at once, full force. Now we can take the broad streets of Troy. The immortal gods who hold Olympus clash no more. Hera's appeals have brought them round, and all agree. Griefs are about to crush the men of Troy. At that command, the dream went winging off, and passing quickly along the fast trim ships, made for the king, and found him soon, sound asleep in his tent, with refreshing God-sent slumber drifted around him. Hovering at his head, the vision rose like Nestor, Menelaus' son, the chief Agamemnon honored most. Inspired with Nestor's voice and sent by Zeus, the dream cried out, "Still asleep, Agamemnon, the son of Atreus, that skilled breaker of horses? How can you sleep all night, a man weighed down with duties, your armies turning over their lives to your command, responsibility so heavy? Listen to me quickly. I bring you a message sent by Zeus, a world away, but he has you in his heart. He pities you now. Zeus commands you to arm your long-haired Achaeans to attack at once, full force. Now you can take the broad streets of Troy. The immortal gods who hold Olympus clash no more. Hera's appeals have brought them round, and all agree. Griefs from Zeus are about to crush the men of Troy. But keep this message firmly in your mind. Remember, let no loss of memory overcome you when the sweet grip of slumber sets you free." With that, the dream departed, leaving him there, his heart racing with hopes that would not come to pass. He thought he would take the city of Priam then, that very day, the fool. How could he know what work the father had in mind? The father, still bent on plaguing the Argives and Trojans both, with wounds and groans in the bloody press of battle.
So you can see a couple of things. The duplicity of Zeus, who sends this dream. But to me, the most remarkable aspect of this was the dream itself, how it's personified. He sends the dream, and the dream is winging words through the mind. And then the dream comes up in the form of Nestor, the revered older statesman of the Greeks, and gives this information to Agamemnon. You can win the fight. Well, no, you can't. But how this was done with these, with the dream image as it was presented to you, is part of the literary talent that Homer is offering us.
And out he marched, leading the way from council. The rest sprang to their feet. The sceptered kings obeyed the great field marshal. Rank and file streamed behind and rushed like swarms of bees, pouring out of a rocky hollow, burst on endless burst. bunched in clusters, seething over the first spring blooms. Dark hordes swirling into the air, this way, that way. So the many armed platoons from the ships and tents came marching on, close file, along the deep wide beach to crowd the meeting grounds. And rumor, Zeus's crier, like wildfire blazing among them, whipped them on.
Thank you, Mary. Beautiful metaphor of the swarms of bees. Homer has one metaphor after the next of the natural world. And this is one of bees, but we'll see some others as we go through some of this text. But here they are, ready to go. But remember I told you that Agamemnon said, well, let's go home, and everybody decided they would go home. What are we going to do now? So in steps Odysseus.
So the soldiers bantered out, but not Odysseus. The raider of cities stood there, scepter in hand. And close behind him, the great gray-eyed Athena rose like a herald, ordering men to silence. All, from the first to the lowest ranks of Achaea's troops, should hear his words and mark his counsel well. For the good of all he urged them. Agamemnon, now, my king, the Achaeans are bent on making you a disgrace in the eyes of every man alive. Yes, they failed to fulfill their promise, sworn that day they sailed here from the stallion land of Argos.
What do you see happened here? How did Odysseus manage this?
I think he tried to shame them.
Did he attack Agamemnon
No.
for his terrible judgment? No. He turns the criticism to the men who are leaving because Agamemnon said it's okay to go. Odysseus knows you can't go head-to-head with Agamemnon. He is the leader. So instead, he says, look what these men are doing to you. And he shames Agamemnon into realizing that that can't happen. So rather than approach Agamemnon directly, he approaches him indirectly through the implied guilt of all the troops that are about to go home at Agamemnon's suggestion. So this is another way in which you can see Odysseus being so skilled with words and managing difficult situations. The snake omen is at the very end of this, and Mary, this is a treat, so go ahead and read this for us.
Okay. A snake, and his back streaked red with blood, a thing of terror. Olympian Zeus himself had launched him into the clean light of day. He slid from under the altar, glided up the tree, and there the brood of a sparrow, helpless young ones, teetered high on the topmost branch tips, cowering under the leaves there. 8 they were all told, and the mother made the 9th. She'd borne them all. Chirping to break the heart, but the snake gulped them down, and the mother cried out for her babies. Fluttering over him, he coiled, struck, fanging her wing, a thin, high shriek. But once he swallowed down the sparrow with her brood, the son of crooked Cronus, who sent the serpent forth, turned him into a sign, a monument clear to see. Zeus struck him to stone, and we stood by, amazed that such a marvel came to light.
Thank you. This is an amazing image that Homer provides for us, but I thought the wording, fanging her wing, you can get a sense of, just got the mother. And then Zeus turns the snake to stone, and it's told to us that that is a sign that Troy will fall. It'll take 10 years. This is 9 sparrows, and then in the 10th year, Troy will fall. But this is how Zeus is going to have this happen, and this is how Homer portrays this omen of the snake. Book 3. Ty Wells was going to read this for us, but he couldn't come, so I will do this. And there are a couple of interesting parts to this. It's in the 10th year of the conflict, and the war and the fighting is going to begin. Helen and Priam are up on the walls, and they're going to look out over the plain and see who's down there. And the word is tychoscopia, viewing things from the wall. Is that right, Stephen? Yep. And Paris decides he's going to challenge Menelaus for a one-on-one, the Monomakh. We'll see what happens there. After Paris realizes it's such a bad decision, he shrinks from combat. But Hector, his brother, chides him, and so he goes out to fight. Menelaus overcomes Paris. He has him by the helmet. He's about to decapitate him with his sword. But remember, Aphrodite is the one who helped Paris get together with Helen. So Aphrodite appears on the plain and breaks the strap underneath his helmet. And so Menelaus, instead of pulling the head off, pulls only the helmet. And then Aphrodite shrouds Paris in mist and takes him back to the castle. Helen is outraged. She chastises him, but then she sleeps with him. And Homer says, there they are having sex up in the palace, and Menelaus is down on the plain looking for what the hell happened to him? Where did he go? And that's the way he leaves it with that. And the point I'd like to make also is that Helen is able to seduce almost everyone in this story. She is so beautiful. And we'll have to deal with, how do you deal with beauty that's that profound? So I'll read this. And Iris came on Helen in her rooms, weaving a growing web, a dark red folding robe, working into the weft the endless bloody struggles, stallion-breaking Trojans and Argives armed in bronze, had suffered all for her at the god of battle's hands. Iris, racing the wind, brushed close and whispered, come, dear girl, come quickly, so you can see what wondrous things they're doing. Stallion-breaking Trojans and Argives armed in bronze. A moment ago, they longed to kill each other, longed for heartbreaking, inhuman warfare on the plain. Now those very warriors stand at ease in silence. The fighting stopped. They lean against their shields, their long lances stuck in the ground beside them. Think of it. Paris and Menelaus, loved by Ares, the god of war, go to fight it out with their rugged spears, all for you. And the man who wins that duel, you'll be called his wife. And with those words, the goddess filled her heart with yearning, warm and deep, for her husband. This is Menelaus, long ago from Sparta, and her city and her parents. So we have a little insight into Helen. She has some regret. She's realizing that she may not have made such a good decision. But there's another part here that I wanted to bring up with it, weaving a growing web. Weaving is such an important metaphor throughout all of these stories that I wanted to bring it to our attention early on that there are really three stringed instruments, if you think about it, that populate our stories. And they are a bow, a lyre, and a loom. And in a way, the loom, with our ability to weave stories, tells us about the war fought with the bow and arrow, and the peace sung by the lyre. So these three stringed instruments come throughout our story, and the idea of weaving a story, weaving a web, is important, both in this story and the Odyssey, and it's introduced to us here. To make sure I know which way I'm going here. These are some really remarkable words. Let's stop. Beauty, terrible beauty. Did you all ever think of beauty being terrible? Have you ever used those words together? What awful beauty. That's just the worst. Look at that awful beauty. And yet, you realize the implications of this. Homer's right. Her beauty has brought tremendous suffering. And he calls it for what it is. It's beauty, terrible beauty. A deathless goddess, so she strikes our eyes, but still ravishing as she is, let her go home in the long ships. These are the people of Troy saying, let's get her out of here. And not be left behind. For us and for our children down the years, an irresistible sorrow. They murmured low, but Priam, king of Troy, raising his voice, called across to Helen, come over here, dear child, sit in front of me, so you can see your husband of long ago, your kinsman and your people. I don't blame you, I hold the gods to blame. She has beguiled almost everybody. While she's up there, she's identifying the troops and the Greeks because she came from Sparta and she knows them. That man is Atreus' son Agamemnon, lord of empires, both a mighty king and a strong spearman too. And he used to be my kinsman, whore that I am. there was a world, or was it all a dream? She's having some reflection, some regrets, and even wondering if it was real. Does that ever happen to us? And now she describes Odysseus, and I like this. And she's describing her recollection of Odysseus. But when Odysseus sprang up, the famed tactician would just stand there, staring down hard, his eyes fixed on the ground, never shifting his scepter back and forth, clutching it stiff and still like a mindless man. You'd think him a sullen fellow or just a plain fool. But when he let loose that great voice from his chest and the words came piling on like a driving winter blizzard, then no man alive could rival Odysseus. Odysseus, we no longer gazed in wonder at his looks. Another manifestation of the skill with which Odysseus managed language. So we're up to book 4, and this is a long reading. Stephen, thank you for doing it. And you are welcome to comment on it as you go through it if you see something you'd like us to be aware of, and we can have a dialogue on that. But let me get us there first. Zeus doesn't like the Greeks. He's determined to save Troy. Hera can't stand Troy. She's determined to have the Greeks fight. And Athena schemes to break the truce, because there they are sitting there waiting for Menelaus and for Paris to fight. They're not doing it. And so going to break the truce, and Pandarus breaks the truce. And Stephen will read that for us. I'd like to make the point here as we go through this. Homer is impartial. He's speaking this from the Greeks' point of view, but he doesn't necessarily take the Greek side. So he will speak with equal passion about the Greeks and the Trojans and the tragedy that he perceives as equal on both sides, that war is bad, doesn't make any difference who's involved. So Homer's impartial and therefore a very reliable resource for us. This is Pandarus Breaks the Truth.
So remember, Menelaus is out, he's in the Monomakh. He's in single combat, but his single combatant has been spirited away. So he's just completely exposed. And then we see Athena at her most devilish. So Athena fired the fool's heart inside him. Then and there he unstrapped his polished bow, the horn of a wild goat he'd shot in the chest one day as the springy ibex clambered down a cliff. Lurking there under cover, he hit it in the heart, and the fine kill went sprawling down the rocks. The horns on its head ran 16 hands in length, and a bowyer, good with goat horn, worked them up, fitted, clasped them tight, sanded them smooth, and set the golden notch rings at the tips. Superb equipment. Bending it back hard, the archer strung his bow, propping an end against the ground as cohorts braced their shields in a tight wedge to hide him. Fearing bands of Argives might just leap to their feet before he could hit Menelaus, Atreus' fighting son, he flipped the lid of his quiver, plucked an arrow fletched and never shot, a shaft of black pain. Quickly notching the sharp arrow on the string, he swore to Apollo, wolf god, glorious archer, he'd slaughter splendid victims, newborn lambs, when he marched home to Zela's sacred city. Squeezing the nock and string together, drawing the gut back to his nipple, iron head to the hand grip, till he flexed the great weapon back in a half-circle curve. The bow sprang. The string sang out, arrow shot away, razor sharp and raging to whip through Argive ranks. But you, Menelaus, the blessed deathless gods did not forget you. Zeus's daughter, the queen of fighters, first of all. She reared before you, skewed the tearing shaft, flicking it off your skin as quick as a mother flicks a fly from her baby sleeping softly. Athena's own hand deflected it down the belt, where the gold buckles clasp and breastplates overlap. The shaft pierced the tight belt's twisted thongs, piercing the blazoned plates, piercing the guard he wore to shield his loins and block the spears, his best defense. The shaft pierced him even this, the tip of the weapon grazing the man's flesh, and dark blood came spurting from the wound.
I just pause there for just a minute. Thanks, Stephen. That's terrific. As a mother flicks a fly from her sleeping baby, an iron-headed arrow aimed directly at Menelaus. Homer has us going one way and then another. And that beautiful description of how he made the bow in the first place. He doesn't say he took his bow and put an arrow in there. He told us about the ibex that he killed and how many hands and the horns and how he... So the skill at making this is part of the story. This is quite a bow. And there is Pandarus hiding behind everybody's shields so nobody can see him. Back to the nipple. As a mother flicks a fly from a sleeping baby. And he's been wounded. We didn't know that would happen. We thought that the Trojans would get destroyed and that Menelaus would go home, and here he is bleeding. So the arrow has struck, he is bleeding, and then what happens? Where does Homer take us?
Picture a woman dyeing ivory blood red, a Carian or a Maeonian staining a horse's cheekpiece, and it's stored away in a vault, and troops of riders long to sport the ornament. True, but there it lies as a king's splendor, kept and prized twice over, his team's adornment, his driver's pride and glory. So now, Menelaus, the fresh blood went staining down your sturdy thighs, your shins and well-turned ankles. The Lord of Men, Agamemnon, shuddered, frightened to see the dark blood gushing from the wound. And veteran Menelaus cringed himself, but saw the lashing cords and barbs outside the gash, and his courage flooded back inside his chest. Nevertheless, King Agamemnon, groaning heavily, grasped Menelaus' hand and spoke out, for the men, as friends around him, groaned as well. "Dear brother, that truce I sealed in blood was death for you, setting you out alone, exposed before our lines to fight the Trojans. Look how the men of Troy have laid you low, trampling down our solemn, binding truce. But they will never go for nothing, the oaths, the blood of the lambs, the unmixed wine we poured, the firm clasp of the right hand we trusted. Never, even if Zeus's wrath does not strike home at once, he'll strike in his own good time with greater fury. Transgressors will pay the price, a tremendous price, with their own heads, their wives, and all their children. Yes, for in my heart and soul I know this well. The day will come when sacred Troy must die. Priam must die, and all his people with him, Priam, who hurls the strong ash spear. The son of Kronos, Zeus, throned aloft in the heavens where he lives, Zeus himself will brandish over their heads his black storm shield. Enraged at their deceit, nothing can stop it now. All this will come to pass. But I will suffer terrible grief for you, Menelaus, if you die now, if you fill out your destiny now, and I go back to parching Argos in disgrace. For the men will turn their minds towards home at once, and we must leave Priam and all the men of Troy a trophy to glory over, Helen, queen of Argos. But the plowland here will rot your bones, my brother, as you lie dead in Troy, your mission left unfinished. Then some Trojan will glory, swaggering, arrogant, leaping down on the grave of famous Menelaus. Let Agamemnon wreak his anger so on all his foes, just as he led his armies here for nothing. Failure. Now, home, he's gone to the dear land of his fathers, his warships empty, leaving behind the hero Menelaus moldering in his wake. So some Trojan will trumpet. Let the great earth gape and take me down that day. But the red-haired Menelaus tried to calm him. Courage! Don't alarm the men, not for a moment. The point's not lodged in a mortal spot, you see. My glistening war belt stopped the shot in front, my loin piece and the plated guard below it. Gear the bronzesmiths hammered out for me. And Marshal Agamemnon took his lead. Pray God you're right, dear brother Menelaus. But the wound, a healer will treat it, apply drugs, and put a stop to the black waves of pain. Agamemnon turned to the sacred herald. Quick, Talthybius, call Machaon here, the son of Asclepius, that unfailing healer, to see to Menelaus, Atreus' fighting son.
That was just great, Stephen. Wonderful. Thank you, Maury.
When he's describing the red-haired Menelaus, is that a reference of distinction,
Yes.
insult, or?
No, it's a distinction. Menelaus was thought to be red-haired. He was from Sparta. And the Spartans actually had been part of the Dorian invasion from Indo-European northern areas, and they were thought to be red-haired. So by being red-haired, you were Spartan. Stephen, thank you. That was just wonderful. I'm so glad you got that. I wanted to have the longer passage read just so you could see how Homer takes us back and forth. There's Pandarus about to shoot the arrow, but we got to find out how he made the bow and how he shot the ibex and how he's hiding behind and the arrow was going right for Menelaus until Athena does that. And then but no, did it really work? There he is wounded, he's bleeding. We don't know whether he's living or dying. And Homer plays us back and forth. And just at the moment when the arrow's on the way, he then takes us off to standing a cheek piece for a horse. And we have to get through that before we find out what's really happening. And Agamemnon thinks he is going to die, but that's not what happens. Stephen.
I can't resist it. So, Athena set up the betrayal. She set up the assassination, and then she foiled it. This is another moment when the second piece begins, and it says it's blood red. It's not what the Greek says. The Greek says it's the red of a marine shell that is used for dyeing the robes of kings.
Right.
And it's a sort of a reddish purple.
Tyrian purple.
And it's, so the irony, the doubleness there is his own clothing is dyed the royal red with his royal blood.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, it's, in the Greek, it's really clear.
And the Greeks sitting around this big amphitheater, watching Homer sing this on a lyre and dactylic hexameter, get this. This is not something that's going past the audience. They understand what's going on here. But I think you can see the skill with which he prepared this remarkable scene of the attempt on Menelaus' life.
From a snail.
Pardon me?
All the things.
Fate? I think you're right. That's what Homer would say.
You told me about this years ago, how this was done.
We have a few more chapters to go through, so I'll try to go as quickly as I can. In Book 5, Diomedes fights, and we're not going to read this, but it introduces the concept of Arastia. And Arastia is when a hero has his finest moment in battle. And a hero wants to have an Arastia because then he has Kleos, he has the fame. And there are a number of people that have it. All of these heroes, in one way or another, have their Arastia. Not everybody, but these are the ones, and Homer uses this concept of the Arastia as he comes to a particular point in the story to tell you the Arastia of Diomedes, the Arastia of Agamemnon, and what does it look like. It's part of the way he can tell the story by going back in a repetitive way. So Hector returns to Troy because Paris has already gone back. And before he does that, though, there's a fascinating little interchange between a Greek and a Trojan. The Diomedes is the great Greek warrior, and Glaucus is a great Trojan warrior. And they're getting ready to fight. And as Homer would do, he'd have each person in this one-to-one conflict tell you a little bit about themselves. So Diomedes says, well, I'm Diomedes, and here's my father, and here's my grandfather, and here's where I came from, and I'm going to kill you. And Glaucus says, and I'm Glaucus, and I'm from Troy, and here's my father, and here's my grandfather, and I'm going to kill you. And then they both stop and say, wait a minute, our grandfathers were friends. We can't fight. It's the whole concept of xenia, about being a good host. If you have that relationship with somebody, you cannot fight them. So both Glaucus and Diomedes, ready to tear each other to pieces, realize that their grandfathers were friends, that they had stayed in each other's homes, and that they were not going to fight. So they swap armor, say goodbye, and the comment that is made is, well, there are plenty of other people for us to kill. And they don't. And that ends that little interchange. But the whole concept of xenia and being hospitable is important in these stories. Hector is the most completely developed man in the story, and I think we're going to read a little bit about this, whoever has book 6. Anybody out there? Okay, I will read book 6. Think about the description of Hector here. In the same breath, shining Hector reached down for his son, but the boy recoiled, cringing against his nurse's full breast, screaming out at the sight of his own father. Terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge of the helmet nodding, bristling terror, so it struck his eyes, and his loving father laughed. His mother laughed as well, and glorious Hector, quickly lifting the helmet from his head, set it down on the ground, fiery in the sunlight, and raising his son, he kissed him, tossed him in his arms, lifting a prayer to Zeus and the other deathless gods. Zeus, all you immortals, grant this boy, my son, may be like me, first in glory among the Trojans, strong and brave like me, and rule all Troy in power. And one day let them say, he is a better man than his father, when he comes home from battle bearing the bloody gear of the mortal enemy he has killed in war, a joy to his mother's heart. The reason for putting this in there is to give you an idea of Hector with his wife, Andromache, and their son. This is as normal a family encounter as you're going to find in the Iliad. And to the extent that Hector is fighting to save his civilization, he's fighting to save a city. He's fighting not just for himself and for glory and for booty, but to preserve his community. The level of honor that he brings to that conflict and how he's presented to us as a family person here makes him the most complete and revered member of this story, even though he's going to lose. And if Homer is telling it from the Greek standpoint, he's honoring the Trojan hero Hector for who he is as a family person. In book 7, Apollo and Athena plot to stop the war. Hector and Ajax are out there fighting, but they both have wives and sons. Paris makes an offer. He'd return everything except Helen, but that's not accepted. And so at the end of this, with all the dead on the field, Nestor and Priam asked to bury the dead, and I thought we should read this short passage if somebody has book 7. Please.
Just as the sun began to strike the plowlands, rising out of the deep calm flow of the ocean river, to climb the vaulting sky, the opposing armies met. And hard as it was to recognize each man, each body, with clear water they washed away the clotted blood, and lifted them onto wagons, weeping warm tears. Priam forbade his people to wail aloud, In silence, they piled the corpses on the pyre, their hearts breaking, burned them down to ash, and returned to sacred Troy. And just so, on the other side, Achaean men at arms piled the corpses on the pyre, their hearts breaking, burned them down to ash, and returned to the hollow ships.
Thank you. Here Homer is giving us an unadulterated, unabashed presentation of the results of war. Both sides have just been decimated, and they both came out to burn the corpses of their comrades and to weep.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
It's the same pyre, right? So it's a shared pyre?
No.
Is that the idea? Oh,
No.
they're separate pyres.
That's a really interesting question. No, they're separate pyres.
Okay. The way I read it, I thought it was the same pyre.
But they recognize the need for each side to do this. It was necessary to be properly buried for the soul to go to Hades, and so the ritual had to be carried out in an appropriate way. Both sides knew that. And so this was the time that they decided to put the brakes on the war and bury the dead. Hector keeps all his troops on the field because he thinks he's going to be okay, and he's not. The Greek victory requires Achilles. Remember, Achilles is he's still suffering the rage of Achilles. He's not doing anything. And Zeus makes a prediction called the Boule Dios of how this is going to turn out, and it's not going to be good for the Trojans. In Book 9, Agamemnon really is exhausted, and he says, "Obey me, cut and run, it's time to leave." This time he's serious. The first time he was fooling, now he's serious. Diomedes and Nestor oppose him, and they confront him. Agamemnon says about his willingness to take Briseis away from Achilles, "Mad as I was, blind, lost in inhuman rage." So they decide to send an embassy to Achilles to see if they can't get him back in the war. But he's singing and playing the lyre. It's ironic, I think, that the greatest warrior in this story is sitting in his tent with his friend playing a lyre and singing to himself. This is not a warrior. This is, well, I'm not sure it's a feminine manifestation of Achilles, but he's not behaving in his warrior way. Odysseus makes an offer, but it's not accepted. And here is the first parable in Western literature. And Stephen, I think you were the one that pointed this out to me. And whoever has Book 9, let's read this.
Hal, do you have it? I have Book 9, but it only has 609, so where are you?
I'm starting at 609 to 624.
Oh, we do? Yeah, all right.
How?
I saw you go somewhere else.
How, wait for the
Yep.
mic. Just
Oh, we got a
put it on
mic.
the table in front of you.
Mike?
Excellent.
Put it on the table.
Okay.
Think about Homer's words here and what he's describing, and have you seen something like this?
And I just add, this is Phoenix, who is the sort of stepfather or nanny for Achilles. Achilles' father is Peleus, the king of Myrmidon, and Phoenix took him in and taught him a lot. So after reminding Achilles of their relationship, he says, "We do have prayers, you know, prayers for forgiveness, daughters of mighty Zeus, and they limp and halt. And they're all wrinkled, drawn, they squint to the side, they can't look you in the eyes, and always bent on duty, trudging after ruin, maddening, blinding ruin. But ruin is strong and swift. She outstrips them all by far, stealing a march, leaping over the whole wide earth to bring mankind to grief. And the prayers trail after, trying to heal the wounds. And then if a man reveres these daughters of Zeus as they draw near him, they will help him greatly and listen to his appeals. But if one denies them and turns them away, stiff-necked and harsh, off they go to the son of Cronus, Zeus, and pray that ruin will strike the man down, crazed and blind until he's paid the price.
So I thought that description of prayers was perfect. Halting, squinting, looking at you out of the corner of their eyes. They can't really look you in the eye. And there's strife. And she is in the middle of all of this. In Book 10, it's an interesting book, but we're not going to read anything of it except I wanted to point out one thing to you. There's spies on both sides. The Greeks want to send a spy up to Troy, and Troy is sending a spy down to find out what's going on with the Greeks. And the spy from Troy is named Dolon. And if Homer has a sense of humor, you just might see it here. Because Homer describes Agamemnon, who wears the skin of a lion, and Menelaus, who wears the skin of a leopard, and then Dolon, who wears the cap of a weasel. Do you have any doubt about the outcome of that encounter? I'm not sure if Homer was being funny, but I heard that as being wry, if not funny. And Dolon is dispatched by Odysseus and Diomedes. In Book 11, Zeus flings some more strife. Agamemnon has his heroic moments. And we get to where Odysseus is having an heroic moment too, but he's wounded and has to be saved by Ajax. And in this description of the battle, we're going to see how Homer again turns to the natural world for a metaphor to describe some of the behavior that he sees in Ajax. So I don't know who has Book 11.
No drama. I can't do what I read medical texts.
As you,
They're not dramatic.
we're gonna need you, Jerry.
Some professional readers here.
So the first little passage is strife personified.
There strife took her stand, raising her high-pitched cry, great and terrible, lashing the fighting fury in each Achaean's heart. No stopping them now, mad for war and struggle. Now, suddenly, battle thrilled them more than the journey home, than sailing hollow ships to their dear native land.
Thank you, Jerry. Again, I wanted to present you this is another feminine presentation of strife. And then Odysseus defends Diomedes, and then he's stranded.
Ready?
Yep.
So he yelled, and the famous spearman Odysseus rushed in close and reared up to shield him. Slipping behind, Tydides dropped to a knee and yanked the winged arrow from his foot, as the raw pain went stabbing through his flesh. Back Diomedes jumped on his car and told his driver to make for the hollow ships, Tydides racked with pain. That left the famous spearman Odysseus on his own, not a single Argive comrade standing by his side, since panic seized them all. Unnerved himself, Odysseus probed his own great fighting heart. Oh, dear God, what becomes of Odysseus now? A disgraceful thing if I should break and run, fearing their main force, but it's far worse if I'm taken all alone. Look, Zeus just drove the rest of my comrades off in panic flight. But why debate, my friend? Why thrash things out? Cowards, I know, would quit the fighting now. But the man who wants to make his mark in war must stand his ground and brace for all he's worth, suffer his wounds or wound his man to death.
Thank you, Jerry. What we have here is Odysseus, who comes in to help Diomedes, who does get away, got a wounded foot, but then Odysseus is stuck. And he has to decide what to do. He's just as afraid. But you hear this dialogue in Odysseus' head. What do I do now? What's best for us? This is a classic example of the revered Greek concept of sophrosony, where you try to have the best evaluation of the circumstance and then choose a good outcome, or at least a good action, despite the circumstances which bring about fear or terror or whatever else. And it's how we know a lot about Odysseus. What kind of man is he? James Joyce, when he was asked why he called his story Ulysses, he said, because the most complete character in all of literature is Odysseus. We understand him better than anybody else because of just this kind of dialogue that he has in his head. So he does stand and fight. And then this is the metaphor of Ajax, who comes in to help out.
But Father Zeus on the heights forced Ajax to retreat. He stood there a moment, stunned. Then, swinging his 7-ply oxhide shield behind him, drew back in caution, throwing a fast glance at his own Achaean troops like a trapped beast, pivoting, backpedaling, step by short step, like a tawny lion when hounds and country field hands drive him out of their steadings filled with cattle. They'll never let him tear the rich fat from the oxen. All night long they stand guard, but the lion craves meat. He lunges in and in, but his charges gain him nothing. Thick and fast from their hardy arms the javelins rain down in his face, and waves of blazing torches. These the big cat fears, balking for all his rage, and at dawn he slinks away, his spirit stashed. So Ajax slowly drew back from the Trojans, spirits dashed, and much against his will, feeling the worst for Achaea's waiting ships. Like a stubborn ass, some boys lead down a road, stick after stick they've cracked across his back, but he's too much for them now. He rambles into a field to ravage standing crops. They keep beating his ribs, splintering sticks, their struggle child's play, till with one final shove they drive him off, but not before he's had all his fill of feed. So when Telamon's son, great Ajax then, vaunting Trojans and all their far-flung allies, kept on stabbing his shield full center, no let-up. And now the giant fighter would summon up his fury, wheeling on them again and beating off platoons of the stallion-breaking Trojans, and now again he'd swerve around in flight. But he blocked them all from the hacking passage through to the fast trim ships, as Ajax all alone, battling in the midfield between Achaean and Trojan lines, would stand and fight. Some spears that flew from Trojans' hardy arms, hurtling forward, stuck fast in his huge shield, but showers of others cut short halfway before they could graze his gleaming skin, stuck in the ground, still lusting to sink in flesh.
The spears were lusting to sink in flesh. And this metaphor of the lion backing up that's applied to Ajax, I think, makes it so clear how he defended the ships, and this is very important. I want to go quickly, and just to conclude tonight, the Trojans break through, but this is as far as they're going to get. And when we continue and conclude the Iliad next week, we'll find out what's happened. But Esther has one very short passage to read, which I think is a lot of fun. And this is Homer's personal reflection. He says,
"Now squad on squad, gate to gate they fought. But how can I tell it all? Sing it all like a god."
The strain is far too great. Oh. I'm not quite sure how Homer meant this, but this is another bit of a little bit of humor that I saw in his reflection on how difficult it was for him to tell this story, which it surely was. Let's conclude tonight by just looking at some of the things that we've started at. We've talked about the masculine and the feminine introduced by Zeus and Hera. We've talked about Homer's impartiality and his capacity for storytelling, beginning in media res with surprise, the difference between past and present tense, third and first person, especially in the passage that Stephen read. The love of expertise and detail, and a little bit of humor. His literary techniques of personification of dream and strife, the first parable, the snake omen, the metaphors, especially with weaving and the bees and the wounded lion, the Arastias of our heroes, the Xenia that we've talked about with welcoming people to your home, the sophrosity of Odysseus, arguing it out in his own mind, Hector, the most complete character. We've seen Odysseus' competence, stature, and judgment, and most importantly, the solemn tragedy of war. Those are all the things that we've had a chance to begin our look at the Iliad. And next week, we'll conclude that. And I have some very short opportunities for people to read. So who would like book 13? There are only a few lines. Terrific. Okay. We're going to skip to that, just book 16, a few lines. Esther, you're great. You only had 2 lines, Esther. You get some more next time. Book 17, just 2 lines. Steve, if you're going to be here next week, 2 lines.
I think I can do it.
Okay. Book 18 is divided into 2 parts. Do you want to do both? It's the shield. It's terrific. And then one of the most poignant parts in all of literature is when Priam and Achilles meet. It's just amazing. I've got this divided into 2 parts, but if somebody would like to take this, you'll enjoy it. Mary, you're on. Okay.
Dr. Brereton,
Yes.
who was the audience for Homer and the Iliad? Who read this?
Well, we assume Homer did, but there were other Homeridai, people who were skilled bards that would tell these stories, and they would travel from community to community and perform these over a period of days, obviously, in the amphitheaters.
The elite, was it not, who were reading or watching?
I think it was
the average person.
I think an awful lot of people could come. Now, I don't know about slaves, but I think it was open to men and women.
You mentioned that with the Greek, there's a natural, in the poetry,
Yes.
natural
Right.
template. So when Homer was telling his tale, was he actually doing this himself? He was doing
Yeah.
the poetry and the
Yeah.
meter that
Yes.
he was?
That's what's so stunning about this. But he had so many tools available to him. Remember, there are something like 41 different epithets for just Achilles. So if you want to talk about Achilles, depending on where you are in the poem and the meter you need, you can pull out any one of these and have it fit there. And then there's repetition, and there's different cycles that help you remember where you're going to go from here to there. So he had a lot of stuff, but the ability to do that was really remarkable. Okay, any other questions? Thank you all. See you next week.